Tale of Old Sully House by Thomas Edward Heath. Read by Bethina. Chapter 1. The phenomena which I am going to describe passed under my observation a few years ago. I can offer no explanation of their cause or origin, and merely set forth a plain, unvarnished tale of what happened. It may be that there are times and places where the veil that divides the material from the shadowy world is thinner than usual, and it may be possible now and then to catch glimpses of actors and a drama mostly beyond our ken. In the spring of 1860, my husband was commander of a merchant vessel sailing from Bristol, and, during his absence, I had been living at Cheltenham with my sister, an invalid. After a time, the doctors ordered her to try the effect of a more bracing air, and, having heard through a friend of Sully House, a comfortable old-fashioned house on the coast of Glamorganshire, I made arrangements to take the place for a time. I had no doubt that my husband would approve this step, for his ship was due at Bristol within 2 months, and this was to be his last voyage. He had already told me that before settling down into a business life ashore, as it was his intention to do, he intended to take a holiday and do nothing for 6 months. Cosy quarters in some snug corner of the coast, he said, where one could see the sea and do as one liked, without the interruptions of fashionable loungers. I was, therefore, simply anticipating his wishes. Another consideration, and that not the least, was the rent was low, so I took the place for 6 months. It was certainly as secluded as could be desired. Our only neighbour was a Welsh farmer and his family. Cardiff, the nearest town and railway station, was some 6 miles off, and we were 2 miles from the nearest village. Our household, besides my sister and myself, consisted of an old servant, Martha, who had lived with us since we were children, and a young girl, a niece of hers, whom I engaged to do the hard work and be a companion to her aunt. We had likewise the services, when required, of an old man employed by our landlord, Mr. Harrison, as gardener. He lived in a cottage adjoining the stables, had sole charge of the garden and grounds, and every Saturday made a pilgrimage to Cardiff in a light pony cart, conveying the produce of the garden to his master, and bringing back our weekly supply of butcher's meat, groceries, and other necessities only to be procured at Cardiff. He was a Welshman, answered to the name of Jenkins, and was willing and obliging enough, but liked doing things in his own way and no other. Although somewhat higher than the beach, our house might be literally described as standing on the shore. A solid wall of masonry several feet in height, against which, when the tide was up, the waves dashed violently, protected the bank on which it was built from the encroachments of the sea. A narrow slip of lawn, ending in a parapet of turf against the wall, separated the house from the beach, and upon this lawn or terrace the windows of the parlour opened. The sea front, therefore, was exposed, but on every side extensive plantations of oak and fir sheltered the house completely. Eastward, a large and well-stocked garden ran parallel with the shore, and was effectually screened from the sea breezes by a magnificent shrubbery. The shrubs, now grown into large trees, bore witness to the many years which must have elapsed since they were planted. A gateway, from which the gate had disappeared, led from the lawn into a path, overgrown with moss and brambles, that traversed the entire length of this shrubbery, and terminated at the farthest end in a deep hollow, in which more than one tree of no mean dimensions flourished. As I said before, immediately facing the house was the beach, part sand, part shingle, abruptly terminated to the west by a natural wall of rock, running at right angles to the shore, and formed by the edge of an upraised reef that stretched away to what was, at high water, a small island. This reef, left dry by the receding tide, was covered with seaweed, and dotted with innumerable pools of water collected in the fissures and inequalities of the rock, and abounding in various forms of marine life, whilst the seaweed itself swarmed with periwinkles and other small shellfish. Delicacies, highly prized by the lower orders of Cardiff, who on fine afternoons would come down in large parties in quest of them. These holiday seekers, with an occasional party of sailors from some inward-bound vessel, anchored outside the reef, and waiting for the turn of the tide to fetch Cardiff roadstead, or a crew of hobblers, men employed in the discharging of cargoes, and who venture in open boats far down the channel on the chance of intercepting laden ships, and thus forestalling their fellows, were the only intruders on our solitude. Acquaintances or casual visitors we had none. The arrangements of the house within doors, if comfortable, were decidedly rambling. It was apparent that the original building had been partly destroyed, partly built on to in more modern times. Upstairs, long and gloomy passages opened upon the sleeping apartments, some of which were bare and unfurnished, although more than enough for our requirements, were habitable. The largest, and as I should have supposed the most pleasant and commodious of all, had been converted into a lumber room. Its one window, a deep bay, faced the sea, the only room above stairs that possessed this advantage. From the massive beams that traversed the ceiling, the gaping fireplace and broad hearthstone, the mullioned bay window with its old-fashioned casements instead of the more modern sash, I guessed it to have formed a portion of the old house. A door, securely nailed up, but which, with Jenkins's assistance, I speedily forced open, communicated with the apartment I had selected for my sister's use, and I at once came to the conclusion that I would take possession of this for my own. Accordingly, I had the lumber and rubbish cleared away, and the furniture from another room transferred to this, not, however, without sundry remonstrances and audible grumblings from old Jenkins, who assisted in the operations, but which at the time I attributed to an old man's whims and dislike of change. By the time I had hung a few favourite pictures around the walls, established my work-table in the deep recess of the window, and had a cheerful fire blazing up the wide chimney, I congratulated myself upon my taste and discrimination. Here I spent the chief part of my time when within doors. My sister, though much benefited by the change, was still a prisoner to her room, which, when the door of communication was opened, formed, as it were, but one with mine, and I could thus be constantly with her. I preferred being here to sitting alone downstairs. For the rest, I was much in the open air, and never wearied of rambling about amongst the rocks and pools, along the beach, or through the woods that surrounded us on nearly every side. Chapter 2. In the course of my walks I sometimes encountered our neighbour, the Welsh farmer. I had already established friendly relations with his household by means of divers purchases of milk, butter, and poultry. A nod and a muttered exclamation, which I concluded to be intended for good day, was in general the extent of his greeting, until one afternoon, happening to overtake him on my homeward road, he felt constrained, I imagine, to commence a conversation as I walked beside him. He accordingly addressed me in a strong Welsh accent, and with the idioms peculiar to that primitive race, when not effaced by constant intercourse with their English neighbours. "How was you this fine day, miss?" Whether he thought me unmarried, or that miss and madam were to him synonymous terms, I know not. "It was a beautiful day, sure, yes, indeed, beautiful. Was you like Sully now?" I replied in the affirmative. Ah, well, it was a quiet place, sure enough. Very quiet generally, look you. As this was uttered inquiringly, I rejoined that I had found it almost too quiet. Dear, dear now, that was a pity. Sure, yes, indeed. I was never then disturbed at night time by— And here he paused and hesitated, as if he had said too much. Disturbed at night time, I said, and by what? Well, you see, by boats' crews. I assured him that no boats' crews, although frequent visitors, had ever disturbed me even during the daytime, much less at night, and inquired if it was a usual event for boats' crews to frequent the spot after nightfall. Well, he did not know. Not he, indeed. People did say, look you, that at times— But there, dear, dear, how should he know? Good day, miss. He must be going back, or his missus would scold him shocking. Yes, indeed, shocking. Whereupon he abruptly turned on his heel and left me wondering at this singular attempt on his part to be communicative and agreeable. It was now late in August, the weather fine and warm. We had been at Sully for nearly a month, when my sister, whose health and strength had visibly improved, suffered a slight relapse, and for 2 days was nervously restless and unable to sleep. The medical men had warned me to expect an occasional return of these unfavourable symptoms, and had provided a simple remedy in case of need. This I administered, and was thankful to find with marked success. Towards the close of the 2nd day her distressing restlessness gradually subsided, and a disposition to sleep speedily followed. Anxious that no sound from below should interfere with the action of the sedative, I bade Martha and the girl hasten their work and retire to bed, and after seeing the fastening of doors and windows properly secured, my ordinary task, I prepared to follow their example. But after I'd undressed, feeling a disinclination for my pillow, and the night being sultry, I wrapped a dressing-gown around me, and ensconced myself in an easy-chair by the window. The moon was nearly full, the sky without a cloud, and I sat watching the play of moonbeams on the waves, and listening to the ripple of the advancing tide as it lapped upon the reef. Several vessels, their sails glimmering white and ghostly in the moonlight, were passing up and down channel, and as they glided silently on their way, my thoughts instinctively reverted to another ship, far away upon the deep, from whose decks my husband might even now be gazing at yonder moon and thinking of his wife and home. This led me on to picture his surprise at finding me here, and to think of the pleasant hours that awaited us in this quiet nook, free for a time from care and worry, after which my fancies took a wider range, growing more and more vague, until a movement of the invalid aroused me, and I stole on tiptoe to her bedside, but finding that she was calmly sleeping, I crept into bed, and was soon asleep. I have been thus minute in recording my thoughts on this particular occasion, in order to show how far removed they were from any subject connected with the subsequent events of the night. How long I slept I do not know, but it must have been some hours, when I was suddenly aroused to full consciousness by a shrill whistle. How well I remember everything that happened at that minute, for my senses seemed preternaturally acute. My first thought was that I had dreamed, but again the same whistle pierced the stillness, and after an interval was repeated a 3rd time. As I sat up in bed, I could hear the measured rolling sound of oars, growing more and more audible as they neared the shore. Then came the grating of a boat's keel upon the beach, and, after a slight pause, I could hear that a conversation, in which 2 individuals only appeared to take part, was being carried on in a low tone upon the lawn in front. Whilst lost in wonder who the intruders could possibly be, a 3rd voice, loud and menacing, interposed, Angry words ensued, and a violent altercation, in the midst of which I fancied I caught the clash of weapons. This as suddenly ceased, and all was quiet. "One of the boat's crews, my friend the farmer hinted at," was my inward exclamation, and it was with difficulty I restrained an inclination to rush to the window and ascertain who it was that had thus unceremoniously broken in upon our rest. But I was afraid of awakening my sister, on whom, in her present highly nervous state, I felt sure so unwonted a disturbance would exercise a most prejudicial, possibly fatal influence. Moreover, I had no fear that the house, or its inmates, were the object of attack on the part of the invaders. There was absolutely nothing in the shape of valuables to attract the most reckless or needy of thieves, and professional burglars were, I knew, in the habit of going about their work silently, and in a business-like manner, nor likely to indulge in quarrels and blows as a preliminary to their ultimate object. I therefore resolved to enact the part of a passive but attentive auditor, unless subsequently proceedings should compel me to a different course. And now it seemed that a council of war was being held below. Several fresh voices took part in a conversation, earnest yet hurried and confused. Then came a pause, and I heard the shuffling tread of heavy footsteps, as if labouring under some weighty burden, moving towards the shrubbery, and gradually dying away in the distance. It now occurred to me that after all it might be a gang of drunken hobblers tempted by the defenceless condition of the household into a forage upon the garden fruit. If so, I knew their evil designs would meet with no success, as the apples and pears had already been gathered in, and as no real good would arise were I to attempt raising an alarm, while the consequences to my sister might be serious. I saw no occasion to alter my original purpose of remaining inactive. That such was the true solution of the intrusion I felt the more convinced on hearing their steps once more approaching the lawn and then descending towards the beach. There was a harsh grating sound as the boat was dragged to the water's edge. A voice apparently gave some final directions, and the last I heard of the unwelcome visitants was the measured stroke of the oars, sounding fainter and fainter as they receded from the shore. Then all was still. It was of the utmost importance my sister should remain in ignorance of what had happened, so I determined to keep my own counsel and say nothing on the subject, either to old Jenkins or Martha. But as soon as I was dressed, I repaired to the lawn, fully expecting to discover signs of the party. But none existed. Not even a solitary footprint was visible. Upon reflection, this did not greatly surprise me, as the turf was hard with the late dry weather, and on the beach itself one tide would effectually obliterate every trace. A few days later, I accidentally met my friend the farmer, and could not resist the temptation of telling him his surmises respecting the boat's crews were correct. Could he tell me the object of their coming? "Eh? Indeed, to goodness! Jowl, jowl! They had come then? Had I seen them?" he asked quickly, and as I thought anxiously. I informed him that I had heard them only, but that was plainly enough. "Well, indeed! Only to think! When was it happen?" "3 nights ago," I said. He muttered something in Welsh, then, diving his hand into the depth of his coat, produced a huge pocket-book, which he opened and consulted an almanac. "3 nights ago, did you say? What day is this?" "The 25th of August," I replied. "Dear, dear, the 25th of August, say you? Sure?" And again he referred to his almanac. "Full moon this night 3 nights ago they came, yes, indeed. 3 nights from the full of the moon. Diawl, diawl, 3 nights from the full of the moon. Dear, dear." And he walked away, muttering as he went, "3 nights from the full of the moon. 3 nights from the full of the moon." leaving me in blank astonishment, succeeded by a strange feeling of uneasiness at his unaccountable behaviour, and the still more remarkable effect his own words, 3 nights from the full of the moon, had upon him. The whole affair seemed so inexplicable that I was willing to silence any misgivings I may have felt by attributing it to my total ignorance of Welsh manners and customs. In a little while, there being no further recurrence of the disturbance, the circumstances faded from my remembrance, or at least lost all prominence in the more active duties of my daily life. Chapter 3. Another month slipped by imperceptibly. My sister had experienced no fresh return of her malady, and indeed was rapidly approaching convalescence. My husband's ship was likewise now due, and daily expected at Bristol, and I eagerly awaited the arrival of the post that should bring the welcome intelligence of his safe arrival. The weather had set in stormy and wet, but for this I cared little. It is true I was debarred from my accustomed exercise, but I was busily engaged in certain necessary work, which I wished to finish before his return, when I knew there would be little time for any such duties, so that I did not feel the unusual confinement within doors at all irksome. I had been occupied in this way downstairs one evening until long after the rest of the household had retired to rest, and it was past midnight when I sought my chamber. The rain, which had been falling incessantly for the last 48 hours, had at length ceased. The wind, too, had lulled, and scarcely a breath of air stirred the leaves, which, dripping with moisture, shone in the bright moonbeams like plates of burnished silver. I noticed this as I drew down the blinds and was in the act of making up my fire for the night, when I was startled by the whistle that had before awakened me, ringing out clear and shrill across the water. "Here they go again," I said to myself. "This time I will watch as well as listen." So I quietly closed the door leading to my sister's room, in order that she might not be disturbed, and then, hastening to the window and drawing back the blind, I looked out. I could scarcely believe the evidence of my senses. There, upon the bank of turf surrounding the boundary wall, stood a woman, tall and, so far as the moonlight would enable me to judge, young. A large scarf enveloped her form, and the end of it thrown over the back of her head as if for protection from the night air, partially concealed, but could not hide, a magnificent figure, graceful yet commanding. This fact alone served to convince me that it was neither Martha nor her niece, the latter of whom was decidedly fat and dumpty, who was thus the object of the midnight assignation. For an assignation it undoubtedly was. The lady was gazing intently towards the sea and waving a handkerchief, as if in signal to a boat now rapidly making for the shore, and from which no doubt had proceeded the whistle that first attracted my attention. I was too amazed to feel alarm. Every faculty became at once absorbed in the scene before me. Soon the boat grounded, and I could hear the grating of its keel upon the shingle beach. A man leapt ashore and made for the foot of the wall, on the summit of which the lady, now kneeling, stooped downwards as if extending a helping hand to the climber below. A moment more, and he was at her feet. Then, after a hasty yet tender embrace, they began an eager and animated conversation in whispered tones. Meanwhile, the crew of the boat had drawn it up out of the reach of the tide and laid themselves down within, as if to rest, a proceeding I interpreted as a sign that their stay was likely to be of some duration. The meeting of the lovers, for such they seemed, was now rudely broken in upon by the sudden appearance of a third person on the scene, who, emerging from behind a thicket of shrubs with angry gestures and fierce menace, sought to part the pair. A violent altercation ensued. A blow was given, and then, as the rivals, for such I imagined them to be, were both armed, swords were quickly drawn, and the clash of steel grated horribly in my ears as their weapons crossed. I stood rooted to the spot, like one oppressed with a fearful dream. The cry of alarm I strove to utter fell inarticulate from my lips, for my paralysed tongue refused its office. I would fain have closed my eyes to what was to follow, and shut out all the sense of both sight and hearing, but in vain. An impulse I could not control constrained me. Thrust after thrust was engaged. The lady stood by, passive and motionless as if with fear, whilst the boat's crew, either deaf to the noise or in obedience to orders previously given, remained at their post. At last it seemed that fortune was about to declare itself in favour of the last comer. Either from greater strength of arms or superior skill in the use of his weapon, he pressed his antagonist closer and closer, step by step, until his sword's point already touched, and in another instant would have pierced the breast of his adversary, when the woman, as if aroused to the imminent peril of her lover, started forward, and by a sudden movement cast the scarf, which had been hanging loosely on her arm, over the head of the now triumphant rival. He tore off the entangling folds, but his adversary as quickly seized the opportunity to recover his own position, and passed his sword like lightning through the other's body. A crimson streak flashed in the moonlight as the wretched man slowly yielded to the force of the deadly thrust, and fell heavily backwards. Recovering himself with effort, he half raised himself on one arm, with the other extended, as if calling down some frightful imprecation on his destroyers, and, with a look of intense hate upon his death-like features I shall never forget, he uttered a few words and sank back, dead. A pause, a terrible pause ensued. The partners in crime seemed for the moment overwhelmed with the enormity of the deed. Or was it the weight of the dead man's curse that was already making itself felt? The man was the first to recover from the spell. He gave his signal to the crew to join him, and they were soon alongside, callous spectators of the bloody work. There was a hurried consultation, in which all took part, the woman, I noticed, repeatedly pointing towards the shrubbery. 4 of the crew lifted the dead body and, preceded by the lover, took their way to the gate, the rest following. The woman alone remained, seated on the ground, with her head buried in the folds of her scarf, as if seeking to shut out all the sights and sounds. My eye followed the bearers of the ghastly burden, as I could see them at intervals through the opening of the trees, until they disappeared from view in the deep hollow at the further end. Then came a long interval, after which I could hear them retracing their steps. Soon they reappeared, and then lover, mistress, and crew withdrew to the boat. Hastily it was dragged along the beach to the edge of the ebbing tide and launched. The lover seated himself beside his mistress. The rowers seized their oars. Fainter and fainter their rolling, measured stroke fell upon my ear. Less and less distinct grew the boat, until it became a speck, and finally faded away in the broad but indistinct expanse of moonlit water. I was again alone. For a time I was utterly bewildered, unable to collect my thoughts, much less to reason upon what had occurred. When I had sufficiently recovered my faculties to review with some degree of coherence the sights I had just witnessed, I could arrive at no explanation consistent with ordinary experience. That what I had seen was real, an actual occurrence, I never once doubted. But who were the actors? Why Sully House should be the spot chosen for the ill-fated rendezvous, whither the guilty survivors had fled, were matters altogether beyond my comprehension. And when I came to consider that in the morning all would be discovered, a hue and cry raised after the assassins, and that I, and I alone, was the sole witness of the crime, and must bear my testimony against the perpetrators, when I thought that Sully House, our hitherto quiet home, would become a 9 days' wonder, notorious throughout the length and breadth of the land as a scene of so appalling a tragedy, I bitterly repented the day when I had heard of its existence. These and such like thoughts so crowded on my overwrought brain that for the moment the striking similarity between the sights I had seen and the sounds I had heard just a month before, as well as the farmer's strange hints, escaped my remembrance at that time. But I was too excited to rest, and as soon as it was light I went out into the garden and sought the scene of the night's adventure, eagerly scanning on my way the beach, upon the yielding surface of which I expected to find palpable evidence of the presence of the crew, but in vain. This I at first attributed to the tide having obliterated the traces which the men must have left, an idea that for the first time recalled to remembrance my former experience in a similar search. But that reminiscence, with its unsatisfactory and unexplained results, merely served to increase a sense of confusion in my already overburthened brain, and I strove to dismiss the subject and confine myself, for the present, to the matter in hand. Recurring, therefore, to the obliteration of all signs upon the sand, I reflected that, as on their embarkation, the crew were obliged to drag the boat some distance to the water, a needless labour had the tide been still flowing. The explanation I had endeavoured to satisfy myself with could not have been the true one. I could not, however, discover any other solution more satisfactory, and this, to say the least of it, appeared strange and embarrassing. But surprise quickly grew into amazement, and amazement into a feeling of positive dread upon reaching the spot where I witnessed the fatal struggle. Here no tide could possibly reach. The turf was slippery and moist with the late heavy rains, so moist that the weight even of my comparatively light foot left its impress on the surface. How much more so, then, must those men, advancing, retreating, trampling the ground under their ever-shifting feet, have left traces of this deadly struggle? And yet there was not a footprint visible save my own, not a mark that the most fertile imagination could have construed into the resemblance of one. Again and again I searched. Closely did I examine every inch of the bright green sward for a darker spot, the stain of blood, but in vain. The same uniform tint of brilliant and varying verdure pervaded all. I was dumbfounded, and for the moment oppressed with an indefinable sense of horror. I thought I must be out of my mind. Were the fearful scenes of the past night, after all, but the visions of a dream? Illusions springing from a disordered brain? No, that could not be. The whole business was too terribly real, too defined, too coherent. Almost mechanically I turned to the gateway leading to the shrubbery through which I had seen the dead body carried. A large spider had, some days before, taken up his abode there and spun his web across the entrance, and, more than once, I had deliberately sacrificed an inoffensive fly to his voracious appetite. I had done so but yesterday. The web was still there, intact, unbroken, with the dry-sucked carcass of the victim still quivering in the net. No human being could have passed through the opening without destroying that feeble barrier. By this time, however, I was past the power of reasoning connectedly on the matter. I would seek the farmer and drag, if it were possible, an explanation, so far as he was capable of affording one, from him. This idea gave me temporary relief, and I at once started off towards the farmhouse. As it happened, the farmer was coming down the road. My looks, I suppose, must have betrayed me, for without waiting for me to address him, he said, "Jowl, Jowl, they have been with you again? Yes, indeed, and this time you was see something, look you, yes, sure." How did he know? I fiercely inquired. Did he see them too, or was he their accomplice? No, indeed, he never saw them in his life, thank goodness. Not he, sure. But, and here he pulled forth his almanac, was not last night the 3rd, before the full of the moon? Ah, look there, pointing to his book. The day after tomorrow, do you see, is the full moon? He knew all about it, yes, indeed. Then he must explain instantly, I rejoined. Who were they? Who was the murdered man? He must accompany me to the nearest magistrate and corroborate my story. He fairly laughed outright. Well, to be sure. Well, to be sure. Did anybody hear the like? No, indeed. The magistrate. Go to the magistrate. Dear, dear. Well, he never did hear anything so funny, look you, in all his days. And he laughed till the tears ran down his cheeks. I was absolutely frantic at this ill-timed merriment, and could scarcely command my passion sufficiently to speak, a circumstance he must at last have observed, for, recovering his gravity with an effort, he proceeded to explain. The magistrate would only laugh, and the clerk, he would laugh. Yes, indeed. Laugh at a murder, a deliberate crime, I repeated. You are mad. No, indeed, it was no murder, it was nothing. I had seen nothing at all, look you, 'twas only a sort of dream after all. No, not dream exactly, you see, but dear, dear, he was stupid, sure. Yes, indeed, what was it the man in the play saw? He once did see a play at Cardiff. Beautiful it was, surely, and it came on covered with iron plates, like a boiler. Yes, indeed. You mean a ghost? I exclaimed. Yes, indeed, that was it, sure. A ghost it was. This notion I utterly scouted, and he as persistently stuck to it. In the end, I concluded that what I had seen was at present a mystery, that I should do no good by publicly proclaiming myself a witness of an occurrence last night which was already believed by the neighbourhood to be a periodical sight, a belief which was in some degree confirmed by my own experience a month ago, that, as it seemed, I should have an interval of 4 weeks in which to make up my mind what course to adopt for the future, because I gathered that the sight, or deed, or whatever it might be, only became visible on the 3rd night before the full of the moon. I would do nothing rashly, and in the interim, should my husband not return, I would consult some unprejudiced person acquainted with the place, in whom I might place confidence upon the subject. I can truly assert that after calmly reflecting on the whole circumstances, I never once referred them to other than a natural source, or doubted that a solution was to be found, did I know where to seek for it. My sister observed my unusual abstraction, but I satisfied her for the time by complaining of headache, which I attributed to confinement and to having sat up too late working on the previous evening. Later in the day a circumstance occurred which precluded the necessity for further subterfuge. About noon the usual sound of carriage wheels drew me to the window just as a cab made its appearance before the gate, that from which a lad in the uniform of the telegraph company descended and made for the house. He was the bearer of a dispatch from my husband, whose ship had arrived in Bristol that morning. On reporting his arrival to the owners, they had handed him a letter I had left with them to inform him of our change of residence. Without losing a minute, he dispatched a telegram to Cardiff with instructions for it to be forwarded at once to Sully. It was to the effect that, as he could not leave his ship until her cargo was discharged, would I join him in Bristol without delay. Securing the cab which had brought the messenger and bidding the driver wait whilst I put a few things together, I bade my sister good-bye. She was so much better I could safely leave her in Martha's care, but promised to return again with all possible speed. A doubt, it is true, did rise in my mind lest she should be disturbed as I had been, but, considering that her room looked in the opposite direction to mine, that she'd already passed through 2 visitations without being awakened, and moreover feeling certain that I should be again at Sully before the stated period for their return arrived, I satisfied myself there was no cause for apprehension. I took the precaution, however, when unobserved, of locking the doors between our rooms and carried off the key. Then, arranging with Jenkins to occupy one of the spare rooms every night during my absence, I took my departure and before nightfall reached Bristol, where I found my husband anxiously expecting my arrival. Chapter 4. The operation of discharging cargo proved to be a more tedious affair than I anticipated, and days extended to weeks before the hold was clean swept, as my husband termed it, and he was free to accompany me to Sully, with my accounts of which he appeared much pleased. As it may be supposed, I took the first opportunity of acquainting him with the extraordinary scene I had witnessed the night before I left Sully, of the sounds I had heard on the previous occasion, together with the farmer's singular behaviour, and evident belief in the supernatural character of the visitation. He listened to all I had to say with attention, even gravity, but I thought I detected an incredulous smile hovering round the corners of his mouth. When I had finished, he said, "My poor little woman, you have been dreaming. The hints and strange innuendos of your Welsh neighbour, which you look upon in the light of corroborative evidence, are in reality the cause of your fancies. He puzzled you with his vague and mysterious inquiries respecting the nocturnal visits of boats' crews to Sully, and, without your knowing it, they permeated your thoughts and lurked in odd corners of your brain until, in sleep, they took a visible form. Everyone is liable to such illusions. This very voyage I myself was the subject of such an illusion, as you shall hear. It was our last night at sea. We were within easy distance of King Road, but were making little way as the wind, which had been blowing strong, suddenly dropped, and the tide was turning against us. It was about 1 in the morning. I had been on deck all the evening, and had just turned into my berth to snatch a few hours' sleep. Not long before, I had been reading an account of the burning of the Amazon at sea. The story had much impressed me at the time, but I was not thinking of it then. Suddenly noticing a strange glare in the looking-glass opposite my cabin window, I jumped up in bed and looked out. There, on the port beam, not half a mile away, was a ship, one mass of fire from stem to stern. Leaping out of bed and hastily slipping on some clothes, I kept my eyes in the direction of the ill-fated vessel. It was bright moonlight, and I could distinguish a boat with several figures, evidently the crew, making for the shore, which was at no great distance. No lives are lost then, thought I, but on looking more intently at the burning ship, I perceived, to my horror, that 3 figures were still on the high poop, one of them a woman. By her side I could see a man, while half prostrate on the deck was the form of a second, and all seemed to be making the most frantic gestures. Clearly enough, they had been abandoned by the crew to the most horrible of all deaths. I rushed upon deck and ordered a boat at once to be lowered. My maid, who was keeping watch, looked surprised and ventured to inquire for what purpose. "Are you blind?" I exclaimed. "Do you not see the ship on fire away yonder?" And I turned in the direction I had seen it from below. It was no longer visible. I questioned the mate, the lookout man, the man at the wheel. One and all declared they had seen nothing. Against evidence so positive, what could I say? I must have been dreaming, and yet I would have taken my oath that I was as broad awake as I am now. An hour later, a pilot boarded us and took charge of the ship. As a forlorn experiment, I asked if he had seen a burning ship in the direction indicated. No, he hadn't, and didn't want to, that was more. I wasn't the first person had seen the like, and he never knowed no good come of it, not he. What did he mean? Well, nothing particular. 'Twas all right enough, he dare say, only he didn't want to have nothing to do with it. I said no more, and although much puzzled, satisfied myself that it must have been a delusion, a sort of vision conjured up in my brain from the narrative I had been reading of the burning of the Amazon. There now," he added, "admit that my adventure is almost as marvellous as your own." "When did this happen?" I inquired. "That night, or rather morning, I made King Road, the morning of the day you got your message." "The same night the boat's crew landed at Sully," I exclaimed. "Ha!" rejoined my husband, "that's queer. What may be truly called a curious coincidence." The evening was drawing in when we reached Sully, where I found my sister much improved, both in health and spirits. By a few indirect and cautious inquiries, I ascertained that none of the inmates had suffered during my absence from a repetition of the late disturbance. The following day I accompanied my husband in his round of inspection through the grounds and their vicinity. While standing upon the lawn, he observed that from the bearings of the coast he concluded the position of the burning ship he fancied he had seen must have been just outside the island. This remark naturally led the conversation back to my own illusion, as he still called it, and I pointed out where the boat had landed, the exact spot where the struggle took place, the gateway leading to the shrubbery, and the hollow in the ground. "You may shortly have the opportunity of judging for yourself," I remarked, "as the moon is more than half full." He laughed the matter off, but a few nights later in the week, having lingered over the parlour fire beyond our usual hour of retiring, he reminded me, as we entered the bedroom, that this was the third night before the full moon, and should anyone, he added, try to impose their tricks upon him, they might find it a more serious matter than they imagined, for he was ready to receive them, be they who they may, laying his hand significantly upon a neat mahogany box which held a loaded revolver. Observing me turn pale, for at the bare mention of that now too familiar formula, the third night before the full of the moon, an involuntary shudder seized me. He bade me fear nothing. Now I had him to take care of me. Scarcely had we commenced our preparations for the night, when the whistle, shrill and piercing as before, came across the water. "Here they are, then," exclaimed my husband with something like an oath, and we both rushed to the window and drew back the curtain. There, sure enough, stood the woman upon the turf parapet, just as I had seen her 4 weeks before. Not a change in her attitude or appearance. The same scarf enveloped her form, and hung itself fold for fold as before, and again she waved her handkerchief to the coming boat. That too neared the shore, grounded, and was drawn up by the crew, who lay down within. The leader hastened to his mistress, who knelt upon the wall and stretched out her hand to aid the climber. The same embrace, the same earnest whispers followed, and, was it possible, from the thicket close at hand, again the rival rushed upon them. Once more the angry altercation, the blow, the clash of swords. Backward and backward, step by step, the last comer drove his adversary, and again, as victory appeared within his grasp, did the woman dash the scarf in the face of the all but conqueror. Again I saw the sword of the favoured rival pass through the body of his baffled foe, and once more the crimson streak flashed in the moonbeams as he fell, and, terrible to see, though I knew it was coming, was the expression of deadly hate upon his face as he once more called down curses on his murderers. I was speechless with terror, and as I crept for protection closer to my husband's side, with a sense of horror impossible to describe, I could feel his stout heart beat more quickly, although the arm that supported me was firm as steel. Intuitively, I seemed to know what was coming next. The boat's crew, summoned to perform their work, once more lifted the dead man in their arms, and, preceded by their leader, bore their burden towards the shrubbery, and once more the woman left alone buried her head in the folds of the scarf. As the bearers disappeared with their ghastly burden, the spell that was laid on us seemed loosened. Seizing his revolver, my husband threw open the casement, and, before I could restrain him, was resting with his hands and knees upon the sill. "I am determined to get to the bottom of this," was his answer when I tried to hold him back. "Stay where you are and watch. I have that here," and he held up the revolver, that will render me their match, should it come to blows. They have no firearms. Saying this, he let himself drop quietly to the ground. The fall was not great, and to a sailor nothing. I watched him steal cautiously along the wall of the house, across the lawn, and conceal himself behind some shrubs. The woman remained immovable. After an interval which seemed to me hours, the party returned through the gateway and crossed the lawn. The woman rose at their approach. A few words were spoken, and all made their way to the boat. I was in momentary dread of seeing my husband rush from his hiding-place. From my higher position I could distinguish his form, crouched behind the shrubs, in an attitude of the most intent watchfulness, and was surprised that he did not discover himself, knowing his courage to be beyond all question. But I inferred he found, on closer inspection, either that the party had firearms, or were too many in number for him to interfere with. The boat was dragged to the water's edge, and all embarked. The lover seated himself beside his mistress. The rowers seized their oars. As their measured sweep for the last time fell on my ear, I ventured to call aloud to George. "Well," answered he, as he issued from his hiding-place, "where are they?" "They have not returned. And what on earth has become of the woman? She was here as I dropped from the window, but I have not seen her since." "Not returned?" replied I in astonishment. "They have, and there goes their boat. I can see them still. Why, they were close beside you for some minutes. I saw you both distinctly, and was half dead with fright lest they should prove too many for you." "You must be surely crazed, Mary. I have seen nothing of them since I left this window," which he entered as he spoke, and sprang upon the floor. "Crazed or not, they were there, and are now yonder," I rejoined. "See for yourself." And I pointed to the now fast receding boat. He did look, and if ever I saw blank amazement depicted in any human countenance, it was on his at that moment. "This is altogether past belief," he muttered to himself, "utterly incomprehensible. Yonder they go, sure enough, and they stood close beside me on the lawn, you say? You saw us together?" he added, gripping my arm so tightly that I shrank back with the pain. I beg your pardon. I am surely out of my senses. This night's work has clean robbed me of my wits. And now," he continued, "get to bed and let me sleep upon it if I can. With daylight they may return." But sleep was long coming in either of us, and if towards morning I did close my eyes, it was only by fits and starts. By daybreak George was upon the lawn, and, like myself a month before, was searching in vain for traces of the mysterious intruders. "Well," I said on his return, "has daylight restored your mental faculties? And, if so, to what conclusion have you come?" "That Sully House is no place for quiet people like you or me to live in, and that the sooner we quit it, the better for both of us," was his rejoinder. "We will not sleep here another night." "You need fear no further visitation for another month," I said. "Remember, it only happens on the third night before the full of the moon." "Be that as it may," he answered, "we will not make the experiment." Accordingly, Jenkins was at once dispatched to Cardiff for the necessary means of conveyance. My sister and old Martha marvelled much at our sudden change of plans, and, as we thought it the more prudent course to keep them in ignorance of our real motives, they regarded my husband, I verily believe, as a grim tyrant, full of strange whims, and pitied me as the helpless victim of his tyranny. That night we slept at Cardiff. The following morning George went to Mr. Harrison, our landlord, for the purpose of paying the rent then due, and making, if possible, some compromise for the remainder of our unexpired time. On his return I inquired how he had succeeded in his mission. "Better than anticipated," was his reply. "Fortunately, I had a gentleman to deal with, and we soon came to an understanding." "Did you tell him the cause of our sudden departure?" I asked. "I did. And Mr. Harrison at first appeared incredulous. Some drunken crew of hobblers had alarmed us, he suggested. Possibly some of the neighbours had told us some foolish tale. A solitary old house like Sully invariably got some absurd story attached to it, some ghost or other. He had lived there quietly enough for several months every summer for the last 5 years, and had never been disturbed. I asked, did he ever sleep in the large room to the east facing the sea? He replied that he had not. It was unfurnished, a mere lumber room. In fact, that was the only room from which these sights, if there are any, are reputed to be visible. When he took the house, he was told by the proprietor that for many years this room had been disused on account of this reputation, and therefore, on taking up his abode at Sully, he let it remain unoccupied. There was plenty of room without it, and as his household consisted chiefly of women, by nature timid, he thought it more prudent to let things remain as they were. My wife, it is true, he added, did once remark that it was the most cheerful-looking room in the house and wanted to furnish it for her own use, but I dissuaded her on the plea of it being damp and draughty. My wife, I replied, found it neither one nor the other. On the contrary, she considers it the most comfortable of any of the upstairs rooms, excepting when did you say? Repeated Mr. Harrison inquiringly. Except on the third night before the full of the moon, I replied. Ah, he exclaimed, that is strange too. It would seem there was some foundation for the rumour after all. When next you go to Sully, said I, make that room your own on the third night before the full moon. Sleep in it if you can. I will be content to take your word, sir, without testing the fact for myself, was his reply. After what you have told me, I cannot think for a moment of receiving rent for the remainder of your term. I thanked him for his liberality and wished him good day. Then you do not think Mr. Harrison will try the experiment you suggested? I asked when George had finished the account of his interview. I do not, he answered. Were I the owner of Sully House, I would pull down that accursed room tomorrow. Chapter 5, and last. 2 years passed by. My husband was on business in London as a ship and insurance broker, and from his extensive connection amongst ship owners and good knowledge of maritime matters, had succeeded beyond his expectation. In the early part of the preceding summer he had occasion to visit Cork, and I accompanied him. We made the passage to Queenstown in one of the Bristol packets, and the tide being high, hugged the Welsh coast for some distance down the channel. See, said I, we are within a couple of miles of Sully. Who lives there now, I wonder? We will have a closer look at the old place, said George, and he borrowed a glass from the captain. As he steadied it for me to look through, I could distinguish every feature of the spot once so familiar. A gay party of ladies and gentlemen were playing croquet on the lawn, but I noticed the bay window upstairs was boarded up within, and the casements, nearly devoid of glass, were shattered and dilapidated. Evidently the room was still unoccupied. An elderly gentleman, with whom we had already established a speaking acquaintance, here came up, and observing our evident interest in the spot, observed, "A charming place, is it not? So quiet and secluded. Note how judiciously the original owner laid out those plantations, so that the house is sheltered from every wind except the south. You would hardly guess that many years ago it was the scene of a fearful tragedy." "Indeed," was my reply, giving George a sign at the same time not to interrupt. "Can you tell us the story?" "With pleasure," said he, "nor could you apply to a better source for information, as the affair has long passed from men's minds, and the actors died many a year ago. A great-uncle of mine, although in no way connected with the deed itself, was a lad on board the ship in which one of the perpetrators of the crime subsequently took refuge, and I have heard him tell the tale. Towards the close of the last century, amongst the many captains of West India traders sailing from Bristol, none was considered more active or daring than Henry Winstanley. He came of a good family, but preferred making a fortune by his own industry to vegetating at home on a younger son's pittance, and besides his natural love of an active life, he had formed a warm attachment for the daughter of a Bristol merchant, fully reciprocated on the part of the lady, but not favourably regarded by her father, who had very different views for his only child and heiress, and had no intention of allowing her to be the wife of a merchant captain. The girl, however, being wilful and headstrong, it was thought not unlikely that in the end Winstanley would gain his object. The merchant, however, was wary, and rightly judging that direct opposition would create disobedience, exerted his influence with the owners of Winstanley's vessel, at that time in dock undergoing extensive repairs, to appoint him captain of another of their ships on the point of sailing for Jamaica, which was expected to be away for some months. By this arrangement the lovers were separated, not, however, without exchanging vows of never-ending constancy. No sooner had Winstanley departed than the father introduced a third person upon the scene in the person of a certain Colonel Rees, a retired East India officer and a Welshman, very rich and withal a bachelor, on the look-out for a young and comely wife. He speedily, as no doubt the merchant foresaw, fell in love with the Bristol beauty and demanded her hand, which was eagerly promised by the father, who by some means so far prevailed with his daughter that the marriage took place before Winstanley had even reached the end of his outward voyage. Colonel Rees had his town house, his country seat, and his seaside residence, the last you see before you, and this was his favourite abode. Not after a time did it seem less attractive to his bride. Here, then, they passed much of their time, and it was whispered abroad that neither the colonel nor his lady were absolutely content with their lot. He was stern, exacting, and unforgiving, she haughty and passionate, so that with such tempers it was not to be wondered at that quarrels, fierce and not always free from violence on the colonel's part, should occasionally mar the domestic tranquillity of their household. Winstanley returned to Bristol and heard of the destruction of his hopes. At first he was furious, but after a while, in some manner or other, he found means to establish a communication with Mrs. Rees, and possibly this accounts for the lady's partiality to Sully, for by means of a boat and certain preconcerted signals, stolen interviews upon that lonely shore were comparatively easy. However that might have been, the determination they ultimately arrived at was this: she would abandon her home and fly the country with her first and still devoted lover. And it was arranged that so soon as Winstanley's vessel was ready for sea, he should give her notice, and that when the vessel was off Sully, a boat, under the cover of night, should land close to the house and convey her to the ship. We should at once proceed on her voyage, and so make pursuit hopeless. The first part of this plan was carried out to the letter. One moonlight night, Winstanley lay to off Sully, and with a trusty crew proceeded in a small boat to the beach. The sound of the boatswain's whistle, thrice repeated, was to be the signal of his coming. He found her awaiting him, and was about to lead her to the boat, when Colonel Rees, who, it was surmised, had become aware of the plot, rushed from behind a screen of shrubs, and fiercely attacked Winstanley. At first his superior swordsmanship gave him the advantage, and he pressed his opponent hard, when the wife, seeing the peril of her lover, flung a shawl she carried over the head of the unfortunate husband, and for the moment confused and blinded him. That moment was enough to turn the scale in favour of Winstanley. Quick as lightning, his sword passed through the colonel's body. The wretched husband fell back a dying man, but partially recovered himself. With outstretched arm he called down the most terrible curse upon his faithless wife and her paramour. Might heaven's vengeance rest upon them for all time, might the remembrance of that night's work be never absent from their thoughts waking or sleeping, and as often as yonder moon shone upon the scene, wherever their bodies might be at the time, living or dead, might their spirits be forced to return to that self-same spot, and enact again the bloody deed. As the last words died away upon his lips, he sank back, a corpse. The first thing to be done was to conceal the body. Winstanley summoned the crew, who had hitherto, in accordance with his instructions, remained by the boat, and, after consulting with his mistress, decided to bury the corpse in the hollow of the shrubbery. This was done, and the whole party made for the ship, which at once set sail. "And was the body discovered?" I inquired. No, naturally my great-uncle's informant said nothing, because had the body been found he might still have been tried as an accessory to a murder, and at the place itself it was speedily noised abroad that pirates had landed and carried off the lady and the colonel, so that no search was instituted. "And the fugitives, what became of them?" asked my husband. "From the hour of their flight," replied our friend, "ill fortune dogged their every step. The voyage, usually occupying 2 months at the outside, was prolonged by adverse winds to double that period. Contentions arose between Winstanley and his mistress, and on the return of each cycle of the moon, subsequent to the night of the crime, the terrified sailors could hear shrieks and imprecations proceeding from the captain's cabin, the door of which was always locked. When at last the ship reached her destination, the crew refused to return in her. Winstanley and Mrs. Rees were at once married. The vessel received her homeward cargo, and, with the exception of my uncle's informant, a fresh crew being shipped, they set out on their voyage home. They reached the English coast in safety, and were within a few hours' sail of King Road, when the crew, a ruffianly lot, mutinied, possessed themselves of considerable sum of money belonging to Winstanley, which he had with him on board, and securing the door of the cabin where the captain and his wife were sleeping, set fire to the ship, and taking the boats, made for the shore. The ill-fated ship burnt to the water's edge, and went down together with the miserable captain and his equally guilty wife, within sight of Sully, and on the identical night in reference to the moon's age as that on which they had fled from the spot on their hapless voyage. The most singular part of the story is to come. The crew, for most of them were afterwards taken and punished, testified to the fact. It was this: that as they were making for the shore in the boats, they saw upon the poop not only the captain and his wife, who they thought were securely confined below, but, stranger still, the figure of a third person, prostrate at their feet, partly supporting himself on one arm and leaving the other outstretched, as if in angry menace. Who this third person was they could not understand, as they were certain that every individual belonging to the ship, excepting Winstanley and his wife, were then in the boats. "Did you ever happen to hear the precise age of the moon upon that fatal night?" asked my husband. "I did," was the reply. "It was the third night before the full of the moon." Note by the editor. As in my father's time Old Sully House was inhabited, he called it Black Rock, and Cardiff Coalport. About 16 years after my father's death, my friend, Mr. Charles E. Evans, bought the property, and, as he had pulled the old house down, I asked if I might be allowed to use the real names. From it I gather there must be other stories connected with the old house. Though I've often stopped there, and not long after the captain's good lady, I never saw the ghostly crew, and have been inclined to think that she had drawn largely on her imagination. The sequel, related by Mr. Evans, indicates that a tragedy of some kind had really happened. How far it bears out the story, I leave to the reader's judgment. It so happened that when we were staying at Sully House in 1867, there was a wraith. I will relate the tale from a note I made at the time, as showing the contrast between the genuine telepathic vision and a romantic ghost. On Tuesday night, 21st of May, 1867, our cook, Anne Hurley, was in bed but awake, when what she called a vision of her mother entered the door, came to the bedside, put its cold hand upon her, and said, "I am going away." She did not know her mother was ill, had not heard of her for several months, or seen her for 11 years. Our coachman, who slept in the next room, heard Anne groaning during the night, and next morning she was in low spirits and could not do her work. Miss R, acting as housekeeper, questioned her, and she related the foregoing, confirmed by Miss M.R. and my 2 eldest sisters. I believe I was told when I went down from Saturday to Monday. At any rate, Anne wrote, or had written for her, a letter which she asked Miss R to address, care of Richard Power, Esquire, landlord of the estate where the mother lived, Faytleg, Waterford. On Tuesday the 28th of May, the coachman's wife, who was taking care of Northlands, my father's house, came to Sully bringing a letter for Anne, which said her mother was dead. My note does not say if the death and vision were simultaneous. I believe the reply was written by the parish priest. Here is Mr. Evans's letter. The Spinney, Swanbridge, Sully, Glamorgan, 24th of February 1906. My dear Heath, as I understand you are publishing some of your father's very interesting stories, including one of the old Sully House ghost stories, I should like you to know that I am quite willing for you to use the real name of the house in the publication of your father's manuscript. I bought the property, including Sully House, from the Honourable Ivor Guest some 8 years ago, and in 1900 I had to pull the old house down, as it was quite past repair. In making some further alterations in the grounds, I came across the skeleton of a man, the body having been apparently hastily buried in the identical spot in the old garden indicated in your father's tale. The skeleton was found about 2 feet from the surface and was replaced in the same spot by my men. As I only read your father's narrative after the house was pulled down, I never had any opportunity of endeavouring to observe the supernatural appearances referred to. Yours very truly, Charles E. Evans. Thank you for listening to this story. If you want to learn a little more about the story and the author, listen for a few more minutes. If not, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. A Tale of Old Sully House was published in 1906 in a volume entitled Tales in Prose and Verse and Dramas by the late Thomas Edward Heath of Northlands, Cardiff, with illustrations by the author and his grandson. It was edited by his son, also called Thomas Edward Heath. The author was born in Andover in 1825 to a Quaker family of bankers and brewers, lived at Bristol for a while and then settled in Cardiff in 1850. He began writing in the 1860s, A Tale of Old Sully House being written about 1867. He clearly had an interest and fondness for Cardiff and set many of his stories there. The captain's wife, who narrates this story, did not share this. Her attitude to the primitive race of Welsh and her account of the Welsh farmer's speech, stereotypical of how the Welsh are supposed to speak English, show this. Where did he get the idea for this story from? Well, it seems there were already legends about Sully House, and the editor's notes at the end of the story shows this. Perhaps he just embroidered a story he'd already heard told. Maybe he thought it was true, or maybe it was the real reason for that skeleton in the garden. Let me know what you think in the comments, and again, thank you for listening.